Thanks, Raz. Thanks for the invitation to come speak. So I think we're going to take questions at the end rather than through the presentation. Hopefully I won't talk for longer than about 25 or 30 minutes. If I do, Raz can give me a nudge. Yeah, I hope you enjoy what I have to share. So I'm going to turn my camera off for the presentation so it doesn't put too much strain. So I'm just going to be, for the next 20 or 30 minutes, talking through, giving you insights as to how I've used Immunocal in elite sport. Well, going back, must be about 15 years now. So in terms of my background, just hold on a second, that's not clicking forward. There we go. So essentially I work for two companies, Orica I'll come to, but I work for the UK Sports Institute. I've worked for them as a nutritionist and now as a nutrition scientist across the last 4 Olympic cycles. So I started them back before the Beijing Olympic cycle. So I've been working with Olympic athletes for quite an extended period of time. I also work or operate as the lead biomarker scientist and also a nutritionist for Orica, which is, as you can see there, is a company that specializes in bioanalytics and optimizing performance and coming up with recovery solutions for elite athletes around the globe. So I originally trained as a dietitian, then topped that up with a degree in sports nutrition, and my PhD's is predominantly in biomarkers, but I've published papers in fish oils and vitamin D, in addition to a lot of work around oxidative stress and antioxidants. So let's get into it. Any discussion really around nutritional supplements probably has to start just giving some conversation to the risks that are associated with nutritional supplements. So when it comes to giving athletes advice around supplementation, we have to be very clear about the risks that come with nutritional supplements. And we want to be only using products that have gone through a rigorous testing period by an independently verified lab that will screen those nutritional supplements for a variety of different compounds that could inadvertently result in an athlete failing a drug test. Thankfully, Immunocal is tested and is on the Informed Sport and Informed Choice program, so it goes through that rigorous testing. But it needs to be recognized that just purchasing nutritional supplements off the shelves does carry a risk, and that there's potentially 1 in 4, 1 in 5 may be contaminated. So you may have seen over the years, the media love giving attention to this, but there are plenty of examples of where athletes have unfortunately come foul of taking a nutritional supplement that hadn't gone through the appropriate testing, and indeed it resulted in them failing a drug test. So it's an important element to cover off. So how did I stumble across Immunocal, and how did I start working with Immunotech? So back before the Beijing Olympics, so we're going all the way back to around 2006, I was spending a body of time trawling through the medical and scientific journals, and I was looking for where I might be able to find an edge to optimize recovery and make athletes more robust in terms of resisting infection, so to look after their health. And I stumbled across the Landes paper published in the Journal of Applied Physiology, and it really spiked my interest. And that's when I then reached out to Dr. Gutman and John Molson, and they very kindly came over to the UK and we had a meeting. And it's from that point that I've then been using Immunocal in a variety of different situations with elite athletes, and it's those situations that I'm going to go into a little bit more detail with you now. I believe Dr. Gutman has sort of talked a bit about the benefits of Immunocal in terms of the composition, so I won't labor this point, but some people don't understand that whey products can differ quite considerably. And of course, Immunocal is an undenatured whey protein. And just through looking at Immunocal and a standard whey protein here, you can see the cysteine content, which is the rate limiting amino acid for the formation of glutamine, is quite different between the two proteins. So I wanted to, first of all, just give a little background around oxidative stress, in part because I'm going to touch upon it. Something that we do in Orico is we measure oxidative stress and inflammation in athletes. And we do that on a week-by-week basis. So we can capture how the player is recovering from a match. So we can measure it 48 hours after they've finished competing in the Premier League or Champions League. Or indeed, if we're in the Olympic environment, then we can measure it each week as the athlete recovers from the prior microcycle. And that way we can gain some understanding about how the athlete is adapting and recovering. So it's important to us to really capture information around oxidative stress and inflammation. And for those who aren't familiar, a nice way to sort of think about oxidative stress is picture the seesaw in front of you. You've got pro-oxidant on one side and antioxidant on the other. And oxidative stress is referring to the disturbance between this balance in favor of the pro-oxidant. It was believed, going back sort of 20, 30 years, it was felt that oxidative stress was purely a sort of harmful concept, in that these reactive oxygen species that used to be referred to as free radicals purely damaged biological molecules and didn't offer any benefit. But what we subsequently learned is that actually these reactive oxygen species, they're signaling molecules. They're able to switch on genes within the cell which code for new proteins. And indeed, when we exercise, we produce these reactive oxygen species, and they're part of that signaling pathway that leads to improvements in fitness and strength, for example. And this slide might help kind of convey that visually a little bit better. So on the x-axis, you've got increasing oxidative stress. And then on the vertical axis, you've got physiological function. And as the athlete progresses through various training phases and gets fitter, they move up this red curve. And clearly there's a dose of training that's associated with an optimum performance. And we kind of want to keep the athlete in that sweet spot. But if the oxidative stress continues to increase, either as a result of overload, so there's not the right balance between training and recovery, or they get an infection, which causes huge surges in oxidative stress, it can tip the balance. And that is indeed where we might want to step in and start using Immunocal with the athlete. So I'm going to, there we go. So there's quite a lot going on this slide, but managing oxidative stress is the first point that I would make in terms of how we use Immunocal. You can see there's a lot of different elements that can influence this pro and antioxidant balance with training on both sides of the seesaw. But what you'll also see at the bottom there is proteins and glutathione. So we know exercise provides the sort of stimulus for the body to increase its own antioxidant systems. And it does that through building proteins, essentially enzymes. And glutathione is often referred to as the master antioxidant. It's a protein. And it helps the body, the cells, manage that level of oxidative stress. And so by providing a means of increasing glutathione through undenatured whey protein, we can provide the building blocks. So as the athletes progress through those training phases, we can provide a nice layer of support. And when we see spikes in oxidative stress, given we're measuring it, we can intervene at that juncture to try and to give the athlete more nutritional support to help facilitate recovery. And I'll touch on some of these other elements as well. So prevention of injuries and illnesses is crucial. Any nutritionist working in elite sport, this is really a sort of primary focus, is trying to reduce that risk of an athlete developing an injury or illness. Of course, we can't make them invincible, but we can reduce risk, decrease that probability of them getting ill. And one of the biggest risk factors is competition. And I won't read out the text here, but essentially This is from a paper we wrote looking at oxidative stress and illness in elite athletes. And I'm sure you may be familiar with examples where athletes have done all the training, they've got to the Olympics, they're in that final stage of preparation, and they go and catch a viral infection, and that's them, their Olympic Games over. So it really is a crucial element for us being able to prevent. But if they are unfortunate enough to pick up an illness, that we can provide some additional nutritional support to help facilitate that faster recovery. There's a shot of the from the Great Britain Olympics base in Rio de Janeiro. So at that particular moment, Andy Murray was playing the final of the tennis in one of those stadiums. Fortunately, I didn't get to see him. So this is indeed sort of taken from our paper looking at oxidative stress in elite and injured rowers. And you can clearly see on the figures presented in front of you that, when the athlete is injured or ill versus when they're healthy, there is this increase in oxidative stress, which we've captured there. Recovery and adaptation. This is an area that most people are probably more familiar with using protein. So athletes will go to designated training camps. They'll be structured into their training cycle, their training plan. One thing we know, when athletes go to these camps, there's going to be an increase in training load, so the increased physiological stress. And there's a number of papers, I've just selected 3 there by way of example, but increasing protein when the body is under more stress, be it physical or mental stress, enables the body to adapt better. And in the context of the athlete, allows them to recover, adapt, and they get this super compensation. Then when they come down or come away from that camp and the training load is reduced, they experience greater gains in terms of their performance. So we like to use Immunocal around intensified training camps, particularly because as well, during those camps, there is an increased risk of illness as well, because invariably the training volume is increased. What we found out through our work in oxidative stress was that the largest increases in oxidative stress in athletes occur around competition, which makes sense because that's when they're experiencing the most psychological stress, but it's also when they're, working hard physically. In many circumstances, it's going to be maximal effort all out. So in such environments, Immunocal becomes a great addition that we can provide with the athletes as they travel, which in turn can also increase the risk of infection and help to facilitate recovery, be it between matches or between heats, depending on which particular sport. I've just selected examples here, but there are others, athletics being a good example where you have multiple heats if you're going from the first round all the way through to finals. And indeed, as I'm sure many of you are familiar, professional sports these days, the recovery from one game to the next is often isn't sufficient recovery, which is why we see so many injuries in these professional sports. An area where we've done a bit of research, we set up a clinic many years ago in London, what we refer to as a UPS clinic, which stands for Unexplained Underperformance Syndrome. So it's more commonly known outside of the UK as overtraining syndrome, which has its similarities with chronic fatigue. It's essentially chronic fatigue in athletes, but nowhere near as debilitating. So instead of being able to run 80 miles in a week, you might only be able to manage 20 or 15 miles in a week. In some instances, it can be really severe. The table on the left is taken from a paper that we wrote up in an elite rower where they did have very severe fatigue. They had to stop training completely and take a complete rest and a break. But what's nice about that story is that our athlete was able to come back and became European champion and subsequently won medals at the World Championships. Because what UPS and overtraining syndrome can do is finish careers, unfortunately, in athletes. And we used Immunocal as a key component of our strategy in terms of rehabilitating these athletes back to full health and full fitness. And there's a couple of papers which One is the case study in the row, and the other one is just explaining the condition in a bit more depth. Perhaps less unknown is the fact that psychological stress in itself can cause oxidative stress, but Immunocal, being a source of alpha-lactoalbumin, is able to, in stress-vulnerable subjects in these studies, they're not athletes, but it's highlighting how it was able to have a physiological impact in psychologically stressed individuals, improving their mood, reducing cortisol, and something that athletes do experience is increased psychological stress. You know, having to go out in front of an audience of what can be millions, if you include the TV audience, and perform after years and years of hard work, and it all comes down to what can be minutes. That's a lot to carry on your shoulders. So strategies that can moderate or allow them to cope with that physiological stress better, and in turn reduce that risk of infection, because that is the biggest risk for athletes of picking up an illness, is the psychological stress. So I thought I'd drop in some slides as well around Immunocal and greens, because we do use this as well with elite athletes. So those not familiar, it's based around an extract from broccoli, sulforaphane, which is as it sounds, a sulfur-rich compound. It's able to activate NRF2, which you can see on the packet there, which is a transcription factor, which basically, once activated within the cell, travels to a nucleus and upregulates key genes that help make the cell more resistant to stress. Some of those key genes being antioxidant genes. So I'll just touch on some of the research. So been some really interesting work restricting fruit and vegetables in athletes, just to try and gain some understanding of the impact then on the athlete's health and recovery. So the first paper I've got there from Blunkett was restricting the fruit and vegetable content down to just 3 serves a day. And they saw a marked increase in inflammation. They were measuring TNF alpha rather, and other cytokines. I think from memory it was about a 38-fold increase in TNF alpha. So we know that restricting fruits and vegetables or not consuming enough can impact negatively on recovery in the athlete. And we also know that certain environments can increase the oxidative stress load, and in turn that can have an impact on the athlete's antioxidant status. And that's what this paper was exploring, looking at the impact of an altitude training camp. So in some, there are circumstances under which, you know, the athlete may not be able to eat 7 or 8 serves of fruits and vegetables a day. A good example is traveling to a competition overseas. They may not be familiar with the environment or the catering that's on offer at that event. And indeed, if you travel to places like China, Korea, Russia, the food can change quite substantially in Eastern Europe. So being able to provide the athlete with a compound, with a supplement, which you know can help compensate to some degree for the imposed dietary changes, it can be really useful. And there's a number of papers out there actually looking at the effects, the impact of giving fruit and vegetable concentrates, not to athletes in these instances, but there's an interesting study in nurses. So reduction of common cold. I think what I'd say there, intake of dietary supplements was associated with, so the fruit and vegetable supplement was associated with a 20% reduction in the days of moderate or severe common cold symptoms. That was over a 6-month study period. And I think the subjects in that study, from memory, were low consumers of fruits and vegetables, again, around that kind of 3 serves a day. There's a couple of other interesting papers showing some favorable changes in blood antioxidant capacity and improvements or modifications in immune function that would be favorable in terms of increased resistance to illness. So there are some nice papers out there supporting such use. One thing we explored lots of biomarkers when we were looking at our athletes diagnosed with unexplained underperformance syndrome. So that was a key component of the research, was to dig deep into as many different biomarkers and see if we could try and capture some of the disturbances that were happening with different systems that would allow us to make the athletes more robust and reduce their risk, but also help facilitate better recovery. And something that we observed was much lower blood carotenoids in the athletes that were diagnosed with this condition versus those athletes that had never been diagnosed with their condition throughout their careers, which was quite interesting. And blood carotenoids are essentially, it's a biomarker for fruit and vegetable intake. So we're talking here about those athletes that seemingly picked up UPS were consumed less by way of fruits and vegetables than those athletes that were more robust in their training environments. And yeah, actually I didn't go on for as long as I thought, 20 minutes, which means we can have plenty of questions if people want.
Yeah, that was absolutely perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Nathan. I will